Eastern oyster, known as Chrysostrea virginica, has been a native species to the Great Bay and East Coast since the land settling in the 17th century. Oysters have been an essential piece of the coastal ecosystem as they form habitat and constantly filter water moving throughout the estuaries. In the mid-1990s, however, disease wiped out over 95% of the populations of the oysters in Great Bay. In an effort to restore their populations, a combination of UNH researchers, the Nature Conservancy, and local residents have teamed up to try and save this essential species.
So a lot of the research that I've been involved in is focused on bringing back those populations first, and then secondly, developing new and better methods of farming the oyster. So in other words, what we're looking at is the eastern oyster as important in the ecology of the estuary, but also as a food source for humans. The eastern oyster is distributed from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up into the Canadian Maritime, so it's widely distributed. New Hampshire, however, is the northernmost area where there are large reefs, or they occur naturally in large aggregations called reefs. Sometimes you'll hear oyster bars or oyster beds, but it's basically a concentration that's pretty much, the seafloor is pretty much covered with oysters. So in an acre you might have as many as 1 million oysters. That's kind of a rule of thumb figure for a good, dense, healthy reef, 1 million oysters per acre. If you have 1 million oysters in an acre, and you think about what an oyster looks like, it's a rocky, it's made out of calcium carbonate, other chemicals, but it forms a rocky substrate with a lot of vertical structure, a lot of crevices, nooks and crannies. So one of the major things that an oyster does ecologically is it makes habitat. It's a habitat or structure forming organism. So we provided substrate as well as young oysters that are from disease-resistant broodstock onto these hard substrate areas. So it's sort of a two-pronged approach. We provide additional substrate by the clam shells, and then we provide what we call spat on shell, which are juvenile oysters already settled on shell on top of this substrate, and that's kind of to jumpstart the reef. And we worked in about 8 acres so far.
We're looking at the remains, once was a pile of 225 tons of clamshell. So this is, these are clams that were harvested off on the continental shelf, off Long Island and South Cape Cod. We use these shells to build oyster reefs, or to actually rebuild oyster reefs here in Great Bay estuary of New Hampshire. Makes a great foundation, good substrate on the bottom. Oysters set naturally, spawn naturally in the water. They need a place for the spawn to settle, and shell is an excellent substrate for that. For every ton of shell we put down for building a reef, we've got about 1,000 natural oysters to set on it. So it's an excellent material to build reefs out of. We get them from a seafood processor in Warren, Rhode Island. Their name is Blout Seafood. They're a big provider of clam chowder, and they process about 30 tons a day of shell of clams. We get the shells from them. They don't really have a use for it, so it's a nice relationship. They truck them up. We just pay for the transportation. We get to use them for our restoration projects.